Welcome to our channel, where today we dive into an emotional journey with our latest story, When Love Fractures, the heartache of a cheating wife and the journey to rebuild trust. In this gripping tale, we follow the life of Ethan Brooks, a man whose world is turned upside down when he discovers his wife's betrayal. As he navigates the pain of shattered trust and broken promises, we explore the complexities of love, forgiveness, and the difficult path to healing. Stay tuned as we unravel this compelling story of heartache and hope. Ethan Brooks sat alone in his home office, the muted hum of his computer monitors providing a familiar background noise in the otherwise silent apartment. The late October night had settled in over Chicago, and outside, the wind howled, sending leaves skittering across the streets below. It was a typical evening for Ethan, working late, wrapped up in the intricate lines of code that filled his screen. But tonight, something was different. He glanced at the old smartphone lying beside his keyboard, its presence a stark reminder of his current situation. Just a few hours earlier, he had frantically searched through every drawer, under every cushion, and in every conceivable nook of their apartment for his own phone, only to come up empty-handed. Frustrated and exhausted, he had finally turned to his wife, Grace. "Use one of my old phones until you find yours," she had said, offering him a device from her collection of discarded electronics. Grace had always been a bit of a tech enthusiast, constantly upgrading to the latest models, leaving a trail of forgotten gadgets in her wake. Ethan had accepted the phone without much thought, his mind preoccupied with the work deadlines looming over him. Now, as he stared at the device, a sense of unease settled over him. He knew he was overreacting. Grace had nothing to hide, right? They had been married for almost a decade, their relationship built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. But as he held the phone, a knot of anxiety tightened in his chest. He powered on the device, the screen flickering to life, revealing a barrage of notifications that had gone unchecked for months. The wallpaper, a photo of the two of them from a few years ago, brought a faint smile to his lips. They had been on vacation in Italy, standing in front of the Colosseum, arms wrapped around each other, beaming at the camera. It was a time when everything had felt perfect, when their love seemed unbreakable. Ethan shook his head, trying to push away the memories that threatened to surface. He needed to focus on the task at hand, getting this phone set up so he could continue working. But as he navigated through the device, his curiosity got the better of him. The phone was still logged into Grace's accounts, her emails, her messages. Everything was right there at his fingertips. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the mailbox app. He knew it was wrong to invade her privacy, but a part of him couldn't resist. What harm could it do to take a quick look? Maybe it would even put his mind at ease. With a resigned sigh, Ethan tapped the icon, opening the email app. The inbox was a mess, cluttered with work emails, spam, promotional offers. But there, near the top, was a series of messages marked as important. They were from someone named Ryan Carter. Ethan frowned, the name vaguely familiar. Ryan was a colleague of Grace's, someone he had met a few times at company events. He remembered Ryan as a charismatic guy, always surrounded by people, always the life of the party. But why were his emails flagged as important? And why hadn't Grace mentioned him recently? Curiosity turned to suspicion as Ethan opened the most recent message. The subject line read, "Miss you already." His heart skipped a beat as he began to read. "Grace, I can't stop thinking about our time together last weekend. The way you smiled at me when no one else was looking, the way your hand brushed against mine. It was like we were the only two people in the world. I wish we didn't have to be so careful, but I know it's necessary. Until next time, Ryan." Ethan's hands trembled as he scrolled through the email, his mind racing. What was this? A misunderstanding? A joke? But as he opened more messages, the truth became undeniable. The emails weren't just friendly exchanges between colleagues, they were intimate, flirtatious, crossing lines that should never have been crossed. Each message twisted the knife deeper. There were plans for meetings at hotels right there in Chicago, scheduled during Grace's so-called business trips. There were references to private jokes, shared secrets, moments that Ethan had never been a part of. And the photos? Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he opened the attachments. There was Grace, smiling at the camera, standing a little too close to Ryan, her hand resting on his chest, his arm wrapped around her waist. The room seemed to close in around Ethan, the air suddenly too thick, too suffocating. He could feel his pulse quickening, his vision blurring with the weight of the betrayal that was unfolding before him. This wasn't just some harmless flirtation. This was an affair, a full-blown betrayal of everything they had built together. His mind flashed back to the early days of their relationship, the promises they had made to each other, the dreams they had shared. How could she do this to him? How could she look him in the eyes every day and pretend that everything was fine? The thought made him sick to his stomach. Ethan wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, to demand answers from Grace right then and there. But instead, he just sat there, frozen in place, the phone heavy in his hand. The evidence was irrefutable, yet part of him wished he could unsee it all, turn back the clock to a time when his biggest worry was a lost phone, not a lost partner. He glanced at the clock on his desk. It was well past midnight, the apartment eerily quiet save for the occasional creak of the old building. He knew he couldn't confront her now, not in the heat of the moment. He needed time to process, to figure out what he was going to say, how he was going to handle this. The anger came in waves, crashing over him, threatening to drown him in its intensity. But beneath the anger, there was an overwhelming sense of loss. He mourned not just for the trust that had been shattered, but for the image of Grace he had held in his heart, the loyal, loving partner who had always been by his side. The woman who had promised to stand by him through thick and thin, for better or for worse. But this was something else entirely. How could he ever look at her the same way again? How could they ever move past this? As the night wore on, Ethan's thoughts spiraled, the reality of his situation sinking in. He knew that the next steps would redefine the course of their lives. There was no going back from this, only forward, into an uncertain and painful future. And as the first light of dawn began to filter through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room, Ethan braced himself for the confrontation that awaited him. This was just the beginning, and the road ahead promised nothing but hardship. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Brooks' apartment, casting a warm glow over the modern kitchen. The sleek granite countertops reflected the light, and the stainless steel appliances gleamed with a polished shine. The space was pristine, a testament to Grace's meticulous nature. She had always taken pride in their home, ensuring that everything was in its place, that every surface was spotless. Ethan stood at the edge of the kitchen, just out of sight from where Grace was moving about, preparing breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of sizzling bacon and toasting bread. It was a familiar scene, one that had played out countless times in their years of marriage. But today, it felt different. Everything felt different. He watched her from a distance, his heart heavy with the weight of the knowledge he now carried. Grace was humming softly to herself, a tune he didn't recognize, her movements fluid and graceful as she went about her routine. She seemed oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away, unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The night had been long and sleepless, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal, anger, and confusion. He had spent hours replaying the events in his head, trying to make sense of it all, trying to figure out what he was going to say to her. But now, standing on the brink of the confrontation, all of those rehearsed lines seemed to vanish, leaving him with nothing but raw emotion. He couldn't delay any longer. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal, that they were just another happy couple starting their day. The truth had to come out, and it had to come out now. "Grace," he called out, his voice more strained than he intended. She turned to look at him, a smile lighting up her face. "Morning, honey. Coffee's almost ready. Do you want some eggs, too?" Her cheerful demeanor, her effortless smile, it all felt like a cruel joke to Ethan. How could she stand there, so calm and collected, after everything she had done? How could she look at him like that, as if nothing had changed? He forced himself to take a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "We need to talk." Grace's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of concern crossing her face. Of course, she said, setting down the spatula she had been holding. What's going on? Ethan swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. He could feel his pulse quickening, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment that would change everything. It's about your old phone, he began, his voice trembling despite his efforts to stay composed. Grace's expression shifted, a hint of unease creeping into her eyes. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, her movements suddenly slower, more deliberate. Did it not work? She asked, her tone cautious. I wasn't sure if it was still functional. Ethan shook his head, his gaze never leaving her. No, it works fine. That's not the issue. There was a long pause, the tension in the room thickening with each passing second. Grace looked at him, her eyes searching his face for clues, for any indication of what was coming next. And then, slowly, realization began to dawn on her. She stiffened, her eyes widening slightly as she took a small step back, as if bracing herself for the impact. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out the phone. He held it up between them, the screen still dark, but the weight of what it represented was undeniable. I saw the messages, Grace. Between you and Ryan. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Grace's face drained of color, her composure slipping as the full gravity of the situation hit her. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, but no words came out. Instead, she just stared at Ethan, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and guilt. Ethan, she started, but he cut her off, his voice rising with the intensity of his emotions. Don't lie to me, Grace. Not now. I need the truth. Grace's shoulders slumped, and she sank down onto one of the kitchen chairs, her hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the table. For a long moment, she was silent, the only sound in the room the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, finally, she looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. It was nothing, just flirting, she whispered, her voice breaking. It didn't mean anything. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Flirting? Scheduling hotel meets, sharing pictures. This is not just flirting, Grace. His voice cracked with the strain of holding back his anger, his hurt. Grace flinched at his words, her tears now spilling over, streaming down her cheeks. I'm sorry, Ethan. I am so sorry. It started out as nothing serious, just some attention I thought I needed. But it's not what you think. We only kissed, that's all it ever was. Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him, his stomach churning with the sickening reality of it all. Only kissed? How am I supposed to believe that? How can I trust anything you say now? The trust that had been the foundation of their marriage felt irreparably broken, the cracks spreading with every word she spoke. Grace reached out towards him, her hand trembling as it hovered in the space between them, but Ethan stepped back, out of her reach. Please, Ethan, she pleaded, her voice desperate. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I love you. I love our family. Can we try to work through this? Ethan wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that this was all just a horrible mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment that they could somehow overcome. But all he could think about was the betrayal, the years of loyalty he had given and the deceit he had received in return. I don't know if I can, he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. I don't know if we can ever go back to how things were. The air between them was thick with unsaid words, the weight of the silence pressing down on them both. Grace nodded slowly, her face etched with pain. I understand, she said softly, her voice barely audible. I hope we can find a way forward. Somehow. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, the words swirling in his mind, the conflicting emotions tearing him apart. He needed to get out of there, needed to be away from her, away from the reminders of what they had lost. I need some time, Grace. Some time to think about all of this. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, the sound of Grace's quiet sobbing following him down the hallway. A haunting reminder of the fragility of trust and the cost of forgiveness. As he closed the door to his office behind him, Ethan leaned against it, his heart heavy with the weight of the confrontation. He had thought that getting the truth out in the open would bring some sense of relief, some clarity. But instead, it only seemed to deepen the wound, to amplify the pain. He sank into his chair, staring blankly at the computer screen in front of him, the code that had once consumed his thoughts now a meaningless jumble of text. The reality of the situation was setting in, the full scope of what they were facing becoming painfully clear. The days ahead were going to be difficult, more difficult than anything they had ever faced together. And for the first time in their marriage, Ethan wasn't sure if they were strong enough to make it through. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur for Ethan Brooks. The once familiar rhythms of his life felt foreign, tainted by the bitterness of betrayal. He moved through the days like a ghost, going through the motions of his daily routine, but everything felt hollow, devoid of the meaning it once held. At work, Ethan buried himself in projects, using the demands of his job as a refuge from the chaos at home. His colleagues noticed the change in him, how he lingered in the office long after the others had left, how he seemed more withdrawn, more distant. But no one said anything, and for that, Ethan was grateful. He wasn't ready to talk about what was happening, wasn't ready to admit to anyone, least of all himself, that his marriage was falling apart. At home, the atmosphere was strained and tense. Grace moved about the apartment quietly, as if trying not to disturb the delicate balance that held them together. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations reduced to brief exchanges about mundane topics like bills, groceries, and who would pick up their daughter, Sophie, from school. The warmth and intimacy that had once defined their relationship were gone, replaced by an icy distance that neither of them knew how to bridge. Nights were the hardest for Ethan. Lying in bed, just a few feet away from Grace, the silence between them was deafening. He could feel her presence beside him, but it felt like there was a chasm between them, a vast and unbridgeable void. He would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of that fateful night in his mind, trying to make sense of it all. How had they gotten here? How had they gone from being the couple everyone admired, the couple that had weathered so many storms together, to this? He thought about the years they had spent building their life together, their first apartment, their wedding, the birth of Sophie. He had always believed that they were unbreakable, that no matter what life threw at them, they would face it together. But now, that belief felt like a cruel joke. Ethan tried to distract himself, throwing himself into work, into projects around the house, into anything that would keep his mind from drifting back to the emails, to the images that were seared into his memory. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the thoughts that plagued him, the questions that kept him up at night. Was it his fault? Had he done something to push Grace away, to drive her into the arms of another man? He thought about all the times he had been too busy with work, too preoccupied with his own concerns to notice what was going on in her life. Had he missed the signs? Had he been so caught up in his own world that he had failed to see that his wife was drifting away from him? The guilt gnawed at him, a constant companion to the anger and hurt that simmered just beneath the surface. He wanted to blame Grace, to put all the responsibility on her, but deep down, he knew that it wasn't that simple. Relationships were complex, and the cracks that had led to this betrayal had likely been forming long before he had even realized they were there. One evening, after another long day at the office, Ethan sat alone in his home office, staring at the screen of his computer, the glow from the monitor casting a pale light across his face. He had stayed late again, trying to avoid going home, trying to avoid facing the reality that awaited him there. But now, as the silence of the empty office pressed in around him, he couldn't escape the thoughts that had been haunting him for days. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence, and he glanced at the screen to see a message from Hannah Mitchell a close family friend. "Hey, I've noticed you've been off lately. Everything okay?" it read. Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, his mind racing. He hadn't told anyone about what had happened, hadn't confided in anyone about the turmoil he was going through. But the weight of his silence was becoming too much to bear. He needed to talk to someone, needed to get the words out, to release the pent-up emotions that were threatening to consume him. Without allowing himself time to overthink, he dialed Hannah's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar, a small comfort in the midst of his chaos. "Ethan? What's going on? You've been so quiet lately, I was starting to worry." The concern in her voice was genuine, and it was all Ethan needed for the floodgates to open. The words began to spill out, each one heavy with the pain and confusion that had been building up inside him. He told her everything, about the phone, the messages, the confrontation with Grace. He held nothing back, the rawness of his emotions laid bare in a way he hadn't allowed himself to do until now. Hannah listened quietly, her occasional murmurs of sympathy a small comfort to Ethan. "Oh, Ethan, I'm so sorry you're going through this," she said when he finally fell silent. "I had no idea things were so bad. I mean, Grace has seemed a bit off lately, a bit too guarded, but I thought it was just stress from work." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I don't know what to do, Hannah. I don't know how to move forward from this. I feel like everything we had is just gone." Hannah was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentle, filled with a quiet understanding. "I can't tell you what to do, Ethan. Only you can decide what's right for you, for your family. But I do think you need to talk to Grace, really talk to her, and get the full truth. You can't start healing until you know exactly what you're dealing with." Her words struck a chord with Ethan. He had been avoiding Grace, avoiding the conversation he knew they needed to have. But Hannah was right, he needed closure, one way or another. He needed to understand why this had happened, to hear Grace's side of the story, even if it hurt him to do so. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "You're right. I need to talk to her. Ethan, whatever happens, just know that I'm here for you," Hannah said softly. "You don't have to go through this alone." "Thanks, Hannah. I really appreciate it," Ethan replied, feeling a small measure of relief at having finally opened up to someone. After ending the call, Ethan sat in the darkened room for a long time, the weight of the impending conversation with Grace pressing down on him. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, knew that the answers he sought might only deepen his pain. But he also knew that he couldn't move forward until he faced the truth, until he confronted the reality of what his marriage had become. The next day, Ethan woke up with a sense of determination that had been absent for days. He couldn't keep running from this, couldn't keep avoiding the hard conversations. He needed to talk to Grace, to get the full story, to understand what had driven her to betray him in such a profound way. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan found Grace sitting in the living room, a book open on her lap. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the unspoken words that had been hanging between them for days. Grace looked up as he entered the room, her eyes weary, as if she too had been carrying the weight of their silence. "Grace, we need to talk," Ethan said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Grace nodded, setting aside her book. She didn't need to ask what he wanted to talk about. They both knew there was only one topic that had been looming over them. "I know," she replied quietly. "I owe you an explanation, more than what I've given." Ethan sat down opposite her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Tell me everything, Grace. No more lies, no half-truths. I need to understand why this happened." Grace took a deep breath, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. For a moment, she didn't speak, as if gathering the courage to finally confront the truth of her actions. When she did begin to speak, her voice was soft, tinged with regret. "It started about a year ago. After the miscarriage, I felt lost, Ethan. I was grieving, and I felt like you didn't understand my pain. Ryan was there, and he listened. It was wrong, and I knew it, but I was so vulnerable." Ethan felt a pang of guilt at the mention of the miscarriage, a topic they had both silently agreed to bury in their hearts. It had been a devastating blow, one that had left them both reeling, but they had never truly talked about it, never truly processed the loss together. "I didn't know you felt that way," he admitted softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It doesn't excuse what I did," Grace continued, her eyes filling with tears. "I kept telling myself it was nothing serious, that it was just emotional support. But it escalated. Despite everything, I never stopped loving you, Ethan. I never wanted to leave you." The admission was a small dagger to Ethan's heart. He had known there was more to the story, but hearing it laid out so plainly, hearing the pain in Grace's voice as she recounted her mistakes, made it all the more real. And the messages? The meetings? He asked, his voice trembling. They were mistakes. Horrible mistakes. I ended it months ago, but I was too cowardly to tell you. I was scared of losing you, our family, Grace confessed, her voice breaking with remorse. Ethan listened, the pieces of the puzzle slowly fitting together, yet the picture they formed was no less painful. The betrayal cut deep, the trust they had built over the years shattered. But even as he sat there, his heart aching with the weight of it all, a part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that there was still something worth saving in their marriage. I don't know if I can get past this, Grace, Ethan said finally, his voice heavy with sorrow. But I'm willing to try, for our family's sake. Grace reached for his hand, a gesture so familiar yet so distant now. Thank you, Ethan. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to make things right. I'll do whatever it takes. The couple sat together in silence, the gulf of hurt between them vast yet bridged by a tentative hope. They agreed to start counseling, a path to mend what had been broken, acknowledging the long and uncertain road ahead. As Ethan prepared for bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over him. The conversation with Grace had brought some clarity, but it had also opened up new wounds, new fears. The path to healing was going to be long and painful, and there were no guarantees that they would make it through to the other side. But for the first time in days, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, a small spark of the love that had once defined their relationship. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going, enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. The days following their intense conversation were filled with an uneasy truce. Ethan and Grace had agreed to start counseling, but the road ahead felt daunting, paved with uncertainty and fraught with the emotional landmines of their shared history. Every glance, every word exchanged between them carried a weight, a subtext of the pain that lingered beneath the surface. Grace did her best to act normal around Sophie, their daughter, keeping the routines as close to usual as possible. She made sure that breakfast was on the table every morning, that Sophie's lunches were packed with her favorite snacks, that homework was checked and bedtime stories were read. But even Sophie could sense that something was off. She was a bright, observant child, and the tension between her parents didn't escape her notice. "Mommy, why is Daddy so sad?" Sophie asked one evening as Grace tucked her into bed. Her big, brown eyes were filled with concern, her little hands clutching her stuffed bunny, a gift from Ethan on her 3rd birthday. Grace's heart twisted at the question. How could she explain to a 6-year-old the complexities of adult relationships, the hurt and betrayal that had turned their world upside down? "Daddy's just going through something difficult right now, sweetheart," Grace said softly, stroking Sophie's hair. "But we both love you very much, and we're going to make sure everything is okay." Sophie looked up at her, her eyes searching for reassurance. "Are you and Daddy mad at each other?" Grace felt a lump form in her throat. "We're not mad, Sophie. We're just trying to figure things out. But don't worry, okay? We'll be all right." Sophie nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with the answer, but Grace could tell that the little girl wasn't completely convinced. She kissed Sophie's forehead, lingering for a moment longer, wishing she could protect her daughter from the pain that was tearing their family apart. Down the hall, Ethan was sitting in his office, staring blankly at the screen of his laptop. He had spent most of the evening trying to distract himself with work, but the words on the screen were nothing more than a blur. His mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Grace, to the revelations that had shattered the fragile peace he had tried to maintain. The miscarriage. It was a wound they had never fully healed from, a loss that had driven a wedge between them in ways he hadn't realized until now. He had been so focused on keeping it together, on being strong for Grace, that he hadn't noticed how deeply she was hurting. And now, that unaddressed pain had festered, leading her down a path that neither of them could have imagined. He heard the soft patter of footsteps approaching and looked up to see Grace standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. Grace walked in, closing the door behind her, and sat down, her hands nervously fidgeting in her lap. There was a long silence between them, the air thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking about what you said," Ethan began, his voice low. "About the miscarriage, about how you felt during that time. I didn't realize how much it affected you." Grace looked down, her fingers twisting together anxiously. "I didn't either, not at first. I thought I could just push through it, that if I kept busy, if I focused on Sophie, it would get better. But it didn't. It just kept growing inside me, this emptiness, this grief." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. "I should have been there for you more. I should have seen what you were going through." Grace shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "It wasn't your fault, Ethan. I didn't let you in. I didn't even let myself feel it. And then when he started paying attention to me, when he listened, I thought it was what I needed. But it was just a way to escape the pain, a way to avoid facing what I was really feeling." Ethan felt a pang of guilt, mingled with a deep sadness. "I've been so angry, Grace. So hurt. But hearing you say this, it makes sense, in a way. It doesn't make it right, but I understand why it happened." Grace wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I know I can't take back what I did. I know I hurt you in ways that I can't even begin to comprehend. But I want to try to fix this, Ethan. I want to try to make things right between us, if you'll let me." Ethan looked at her, the woman he had loved for so many years, the mother of his child, the person he had built a life with. The betrayal still stung, the wounds still fresh and raw, but underneath it all, there was a flicker of the love that had once brought them together. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. "I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were," Ethan admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe we can find a new way forward." Grace nodded, a small, hopeful smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I'd like that a lot." They sat in silence for a few moments, the tension between them slowly easing, replaced by a tentative understanding. It wasn't a solution, it wasn't a cure for the pain, but it was a start, a small step toward healing. "We should start counseling as soon as possible," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. "We need to work through this, not just for us, but for Sophie too." Grace nodded again, her expression resolute. "I'll set up an appointment with Dr. Turner tomorrow. I know it's going to be hard, but I'm ready to do whatever it takes." Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, a small spark of the love they had once shared. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going, enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. As they sat together in the quiet of the office, the shadows of their past still looming over them, Ethan reached across the desk, taking Grace's hand in his. It was a simple gesture, one that they had shared countless times before, but now it carried a deeper significance. It was a promise, a commitment to the long and difficult journey ahead. "We'll get through this," Ethan said softly, squeezing her hand. "We'll find a way." Grace squeezed back, her eyes filled with gratitude and determination. Together. And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to believe that they could. The crisp autumn air hung heavy with the scent of fallen leaves and the faint chill of approaching winter. The once vibrant city of Chicago was slowly being cloaked in a blanket of amber and gold, the trees shedding their leaves in preparation for the cold months ahead. For Ethan and Grace, the change in seasons mirrored the transformation that was taking place in their lives. An ending of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. It had been a few weeks since their heart-wrenching conversation, where they both laid bare the pain and betrayal that had fractured their marriage. In the days that followed, they had settled into a tentative routine, carefully navigating the fragile new normal that had taken hold in their home. Their interactions were still tinged with the remnants of hurt, but there was also a newfound sense of resolve, a mutual understanding that they were both committed to finding a way forward, no matter how difficult the journey might be. They had begun attending counseling sessions with Dr. Olivia Turner a renowned marriage therapist recommended by a mutual friend. Dr. Turner's office was a warm, inviting space, filled with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that seemed to envelop the couple in a sense of safety the moment they walked through the door. Each session was both a balm and a crucible, forcing Ethan and Grace to confront the deep-seated issues that had festered beneath the surface of their marriage for years. As the sessions progressed, Ethan began to see their relationship in a new light. The affair was still a painful, open wound, but Dr. Turner helped him understand that it was a symptom of deeper problems, issues that had been simmering long before Ryan Carter entered the picture. They had drifted apart over the years, their lives becoming more about managing the daily grind of work, parenthood, and responsibilities, and less about nurturing the bond that had once brought them together. Grace, too, was forced to confront her own failings. She had been so consumed by her grief and loneliness after the miscarriage that she had shut Ethan out, turning to Ryan as a temporary escape from the pain she didn't want to face. But now, sitting in Dr. Turner's office, she could no longer hide from the consequences of her actions. She was filled with remorse, determined to do whatever it took to rebuild the trust she had shattered. It was a particularly brisk Saturday afternoon when Ethan and Grace left one of their counseling sessions feeling more hopeful than they had in months. The session had been tough, filled with difficult truths and raw emotions, but there was also a sense of progress, a feeling that they were finally beginning to understand each other in ways they hadn't before. As they walked through the park on their way home, the fallen leaves crunching under their feet, Ethan glanced at Grace, seeing her in a way he hadn't in a long time. The tension in her shoulders had eased slightly, and there was a softness in her expression that reminded him of the early days of their relationship, before life had become so complicated. Today's session was hard, but I think it was good for us, Ethan said, his breath visible in the chilly air. Grace nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. Yeah, it was. I feel like we're finally starting to break through some of the barriers that have been holding us back. Ethan reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. It was a simple gesture, but it felt significant, a sign of the small steps they were taking to rebuild their connection. I've been thinking a lot about what Dr. Turner said today, about how we need to create new memories together, to replace the bad ones. Grace squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of hope and determination. I've been thinking about that too. I want to start fresh, to create a new chapter for us. But I know it's going to take time, and a lot of work. Ethan nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the journey ahead. I know, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Grace. I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to lose you. Grace's eyes softened, and she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder as they walked. You won't lose me, Ethan. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. I love you, and I'm going to fight for us, for our family. The sincerity in her voice brought a lump to Ethan's throat, and he tightened his grip on her hand. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there were no guarantees that they would make it through unscathed. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. That evening, back at home, Ethan and Grace sat down together after putting Sophie to bed. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the heater as it kicked on to ward off the growing chill. They had spent the last few weeks tiptoeing around each other, avoiding the deeper conversations that they both knew were necessary. But now, sitting together in the living room, it was time to make some decisions. Grace, Ethan began, his voice steady but serious, we've talked a lot about what happened and why it happened. But we haven't really talked about what comes next. About how we're going to move forward. Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about that too. I know we've both been hurting, and there's still a lot of healing that needs to happen. But I think we need to start setting some goals, some steps we can take to rebuild our relationship. Ethan agreed, feeling a sense of relief that they were finally addressing the future rather than just dwelling on the past. I think you're right. We need to have a plan, something concrete that we can work towards together. They spent the next hour discussing their ideas, brainstorming ways to reconnect and strengthen their marriage. It was a difficult conversation, filled with moments of vulnerability and honesty, but it was also cathartic, a release of the pent-up emotions that had been building between them for so long. They decided to start with the small things, simple gestures of affection, regular date nights, and more open communication about their feelings and needs. They also agreed to continue counseling, recognizing that the process of healing was ongoing and that they needed the support of an objective third party to guide them through the rough patches. But they also knew that there were bigger issues to address, deeper wounds that couldn't be healed overnight. The trust that had been broken wouldn't be easily repaired, and they both needed to work on rebuilding their faith in each other. They talked about setting boundaries, about how they would handle any lingering feelings of resentment or doubt, and about the importance of being patient with each other as they navigated this new chapter in their lives. By the time they finished their discussion, it was late, and the exhaustion of the day was beginning to weigh on them. But there was also a sense of accomplishment, a feeling that they had taken an important step towards healing. As they got ready for bed, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, hope, and a lingering sadness for what they had lost. But as he lay down beside Grace, feeling the warmth of her body next to his, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to the love they once had. Grace turned to him, her voice soft in the darkness. "Ethan? Yeah? I just want you to know. I'm really proud of us for doing this, for not giving up." Ethan smiled, a small, genuine smile that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Me too, Grace. Me too." They lay there in the quiet of their bedroom, the weight of the past slowly lifting as they held on to the hope of a better future. It was a long road ahead, but they were walking it together, hand in hand, and that was enough for now. As sleep began to take hold, Ethan's last thoughts were of the journey they had embarked on, a journey of healing, of rediscovery, and of rebuilding a love that had been tested but not broken. The decision to stay, to fight for their marriage, was not an easy one, but it was one they were making together, and that gave him hope. Hope that they could find their way back to each other. Hope that they could create a new chapter filled with love, trust, and happiness. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through When Love Fractures. The heartache of a cheating wife and the journey to rebuild trust. As we come to the end of this story, we're reminded that the road to healing is never easy, and the pain of betrayal can leave deep scars. But through perseverance, honesty, and a willingness to face the hard truths, there is hope for rebuilding what was lost. Ethan and Grace's story is one of redemption, resilience, and the power of love to overcome even the most challenging of obstacles. If you found this story as compelling as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of life's most complex and heartfelt moments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.